A woman who lived alone in her apartment suddenly disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The police who took up the investigation found strange evidence that led them to unusual and even eccentric suspects. Eventually, the solution to this puzzle was closer than they thought. The answer was obvious. Lisa Valdez was born on the 6th of September of the year 1961 in San Francisco, California. She grew up with her brother and her loving mother, as the father did not participate in her life. Despite the father's absence, Lisa had a very close relationship with her mother. Her friends were amazed at how they managed to maintain such good relationships without conflicts. In her teenage years, Lisa became enthusiastic about dance, and that became her passion. Additionally, she became interested in new technologies and began to study IT when this field was just emerging. She began to use emails when many of her friends did not even know what that was yet. This interest determined her career, and after college, Lisa worked as a systems analyst in her hometown. Later, her mother saved money and bought her an apartment in a good neighborhood. It was a small studio in a residential complex on a hill from which one had a beautiful view of San Francisco. Lisa lived there alone, continued to develop in her work, and tried to spend as much time as possible with her family. She also continued her dance lessons and attended classes every week with her best friend. On the evening of the 16th of May, 1998, Lisa, who was 36 years old, invited her mother and some family friends to her home to spend time together. When the guests had left, Lisa's mother helped her with the dishes and then drove home, agreeing that Lisa would call the next day. But this call never came. At first, the mother thought Lisa was busy, as she wanted to go dancing that evening, and decided to wait. But Lisa did not contact her the next day either. On Sunday, the mother tried to call her daughter, but there was no answer. This continued for several more days. On Monday, the 4th day, Lisa's work colleagues called the mother and informed her that Lisa had not appeared at work and was not responding to calls. This caused great concern, because Lisa was always a responsible employee and had never disappeared without notice before. Lisa's mother decided to drive to Lisa's apartment in the residential complex to check on things. When she arrived at her daughter's apartment, she saw that the building was cordoned off with police tape. There were many police officers on site, and when she approached them, the mother asked what was wrong. The police officers explained that the residents of the complex had reported a strange smell from one of the apartments a few hours earlier. The building manager who checked the complaint found that Lisa's apartment door was not locked. He entered and immediately noticed a strong smell, whereupon he called the police. The police officers quickly identified Lisa Valdez. Her partially missing clothing and clear traces on the body immediately made the investigators recognize that this was an intentional crime and not an accident. After examining the extent of the destruction, they suspected that the incident might have taken place several days earlier. The police also noticed the circumstances of the act. Next to Lisa lay underwear. The apartment was scattered with bright red stains on the floor and the bed. The television was turned on and the air conditioning was set to 26 degrees. There was disorder in the apartment, but later the investigators determined that this was normal for Lisa, as she did not tend to keep order. The police also determined that no valuable items were missing. Jewelry and other valuables remained in their place. The only missing items were her keys and her sports bag. Another strange point was that the perpetrator apparently had taken part of Lisa's long hair with him. This collection of facts could indicate personal motives of the perpetrator. The investigators suspected that the perpetrator knew Lisa and harbored a grudge against her. This was supported by the fact that no traces of a break-in could be found on the apartment door. The residential complex where Lisa lived was surrounded by a fence, and one could only get in if one had a key or a resident opened the gate remotely. The police began to question the residents of the complex, hoping that someone had seen a suspicious person, and soon found the first clue. Lisa's neighbor told them that he had returned from vacation 2 days earlier and found that part of the metal frame of his door was damaged, and on the door itself was a barely visible dark red stain. He reported this to the manager, but they decided not to call the police, As it was clear that no one could break into the apartment, the investigations into the Lisa incident were already well advanced, and the investigators were almost certain that the perpetrator and the person who had damaged the neighbor's doorframe were the same person. However, the logic of his actions remained unclear. Perhaps his original target was the neighboring apartment, but when he happened to encounter Lisa, he changed his plans. There was also the assumption that he tried to break open the neighbor's door after the incident, which seemed very strange. Soon the investigators noticed the cleaning lady who came to Lisa's apartment once a week to clean. 2 days before the evidence was found, she came as usual with her key and tried to open the door, but something inside prevented her from doing so. When she looked through the gap, she saw a strange scene and heard a male voice. Believing she was disturbing a private moment, the cleaning lady quickly went away again. The police concluded that it was already too late to provide help at this point, as the voice probably belonged to the perpetrator who was still in the apartment. The cleaning lady also mentioned that it seemed to her as if a black bag with a zipper lay next to Lisa, but she could not be sure, as she had only taken a brief look inside. Another important detail was the unopened envelope with money for the cleaning lady that lay on the inside of the door. Lisa always left the money there one day before the cleaning lady's visit, because she was normally not at home at that time. This indicated that the crime could have happened after Lisa's mother left, between midnight and the early morning hours. Exactly then, Lisa left the money for the cleaning lady. This hypothesis was confirmed by the statements of the neighbors from the lower floor, who heard noise from above that night, and then noticed how someone went downstairs, but could not recognize the person. These details became important elements in the investigations. The police tried to gather as much information as possible to understand the motives and actions of the perpetrator. Every detail, every small thing could be important to solve this difficult case. While the medical experts analyzed the found evidence, the investigators continued their search for further clues in Lisa's apartment. One of the first suspicious points was the raised toilet seat, an unusual detail for a woman living alone. The crime technicians examined this find carefully and discovered a partial fingerprint that did not belong to Lisa. The police requested fingerprints from everyone who could have been in her apartment, including acquaintances and relatives, but there were no matches. This led the investigators to conclude that the found print probably came from the perpetrator. When the medical experts completed their analysis, the investigators received a new clue. Under Lisa's fingernails, skin particles were found that presumably came from the perpetrator, and they were sent to the laboratory for further examination. In the meantime, the criminalists examined the evidence found in the apartment and came across a significant clue. On one of the pillowcases were many wine-red stains, but the analysis showed that not all came from Lisa. Some stains had a different origin, and the pillowcase was sent to the laboratory for further examination. The investigators suspected that the perpetrator might have accidentally injured himself, which happens quite often. This assumption was supported by another find. In the bathroom, 2 used bandages from the first aid kit were found that the perpetrator might have used, as well as his fingerprints on the toilet seat when he threw them away. The results of the DNA analysis showed that the traces on the pillowcase came from an unknown man who was not registered in the FBI database. Skin particles found under Lisa's fingernails also belonged to this man, as well as an unknown print on her neighbor's door. Despite missing matches in the DNA profiles, the investigators now had samples that they could compare with the DNA of suspects. They began to check persons from their database who had committed various crimes in Lisa's residential area and also examined her environment. Lisa's mother reported that her daughter had been together with a man named Albert Kett for a time, and they had planned a meeting for the day after the incident. However, a few days earlier, Kett suddenly cancelled the meeting. The investigators invited him to the station for questioning. When the man arrived, they immediately noticed his bandaged hand. The investigators suspected that the perpetrator might have injured himself during the act, as this frequently occurs in such situations. Thus, Albert Kett immediately came under suspicion. However, he categorically denied his involvement in the incident. Fingerprints and DNA samples were taken from him, which were then sent to the laboratory for analysis to compare them with the existing evidence. To the investigators' surprise, the results did not confirm his guilt. All previously found traces clearly belonged to another person, whereby Albert was excluded from the list of suspects. The investigators continued searching for other possible suspects. They decided to listen to the messages on Lisa's answering machine that were left in the days before the tragedy. A list of 40 callers was created, but one message attracted particular attention. A few hours before the crime, when guests were still at Lisa's home, an unknown man called. Lisa did not answer, and he left a message. "You know how it is, Taquita. Hello, Lisa, are you home?" This message was listened to in the presence of Lisa's friend, who immediately recognized the voice. It was the voice of Albert Robinson, a colleague of Lisa's. Albert had long shown romantic interest in her, but Lisa did not reciprocate his feelings. Nevertheless, they remained in contact at work and met in their circle of friends. Lisa simply considered him a friend. A few days after the tragic incident, when Lisa's family held the farewell ceremony, something unexpected happened. Robinson appeared at the event and gave a speech that surprised everyone. He said that he and Lisa had been in love and had planned to marry and start a family. But Lisa's friends and her mother told the investigators that Robinson's words did not correspond to the truth. Lisa had said that the man showed interest in her, but she had no romantic feelings for him. Lisa's mother added that she and her daughter had always spoken openly with each other, and Lisa would never have hidden such plans from her. Robinson was invited for interrogation, where he denied his involvement in the incident. He claimed to have loved Lisa and to have never done anything to her. However, he refused to give the police a DNA sample and fingerprints, and without sufficient evidence, these could not be taken by force. Nevertheless, Robinson remained one of the main suspects, and the investigators continued searching for new evidence. Considering that he might have been obsessed with Lisa and she did not reciprocate his feelings, this could explain his possible actions. The peculiarities of the crime pointed to a motive, and the fact that the perpetrator took part of her hair with him could be an indication of his obsession. Sometime later, the investigators received a search warrant for Robinson's house. Inside, they discovered something strange. Dozens of photos of Lisa were hung everywhere, which reinforced the suspicions of his obsession. Nevertheless, he continued to deny his involvement in the crime, but this time he gave his fingerprints and a DNA sample. The investigators were almost certain that he was guilty, but the results from the laboratory surprised them. The samples found in Lisa's apartment did not match Robinson's samples. Robinson was removed from the list of suspects, and the police continued their search. But despite all efforts, the investigators repeatedly hit dead ends. Finally, the case came to a standstill for many years. The investigators regularly requested updates to check the perpetrator's DNA sample with databases, hoping that he would appear there for other crimes. But this did not happen. It seemed strange to the police officers that someone who is capable of such a crime does not appear in the databases, as they doubted that this was his first serious misstep. Over the course of the following years, the investigators continued to check the databases hoping for a match, but each time they encountered emptiness. Lisa's mother appeared on television several times, asked for help, and shared any information that could help with the investigation. But the investigators could not find any new traces. In the year 2010, the investigators learned about a new DNA analysis technology that was used by the FBI. This technology made it possible to compare the perpetrator's DNA sample with a database and find his relatives. Unlike genetic genealogy, which emerged a few years later, this method only worked with close relatives like father or brother. In the year 2011, the police requested such comparisons and began to wait. On the 2nd of September, the lead investigator received a call from the FBI in which he was told two messages, one good and one bad. They said that they would not conduct a comparison with relatives from the database, and the reason for this was very surprising. For the accuracy of the investigation, the DNA samples of the suspects were always checked again before a comparison was conducted. 13 years after the crime, a complete match emerged. The DNA matched the sample of Anthony Hughes, who was 52 years old. Recently, his data had been entered into the FBI database. Previously, Anthony had a long list of offenses, but none of them required DNA submission for the FBI database. However, after changes to California laws, all criminals, regardless of the severity of their crimes, must submit DNA samples. Thus, Anthony's sample was entered into the database after one of his arrests for a minor offense. His fingerprints were also in the database and matched the print that was found on the toilet seat in Lisa's apartment. The experts even identified the exact finger that had left this print. Before Anthony was arrested, the investigators tried to find additional evidence that confirmed his involvement. In doing so, they encountered an unexpected turn. After the crime, the police listened to an audio cassette with messages on Lisa's answering machine. 13 years ago, however, only the calls that had come in before the incident were examined. Now, many years later, the investigators discovered that Anthony Hughes had called Lisa the day after the incident and left her a message. The content was quite ordinary and aroused no suspicion. But if the police had investigated Anthony at that time, they would have discovered not only his extensive criminal past, but also something more important. When the investigators began to search through Lisa's things, they found a telephone number in her notebook that belonged to Anthony. This confirmed that Lisa knew him. After conversations with Lisa's friends, the police learned that she had met with Anthony for a time in high school. This gave the investigators sufficient reason to interrogate the man. At this time, Anthony had no fixed residence, which made his search more difficult. To prevent a possible flight of the suspect, the investigators decided to proceed very carefully. After they had arrested Anthony, they explained to him that they were investigating a series of crimes in San Francisco. Anthony offered no resistance during the arrest and followed the police without incidents. During the interrogation, the investigators first spoke about cases that had nothing to do with Anthony in order not to arouse suspicion in him. Then they gradually switched to his criminal background and asked whether he knew Lisa Valdez. Initially, Anthony denied any acquaintance with her, but when he was shown her photo, he admitted that he had met her in high school. He added that he had not seen her since the end of the 80s and tried to convince the investigators that they had had no contact since then. The investigators asked him questions for hours about his relationship with Lisa to find out whether he really had not seen her since then. Finally, they asked their key question: why his DNA was found in Lisa's apartment in 1998. When he heard this, Anthony suddenly broke into tears and asked the investigators for a pen and a sheet of paper. The police thought he wanted to write a confession and gave him everything he needed. To their surprise, Anthony suddenly tried to use the pen for other purposes, and the investigators had to restrain him. While they held him and waited for reinforcement, Anthony continued to cry and scream and claimed that someone was trying to pin a crime on him that he had not committed. Finally, Anthony was charged in Lisa's case, and the investigators informed her relatives that a suspect had been found. However, the court trial did not begin until 4 years later, and Lisa's family had to wait a long time for justice. At the first court sessions, Anthony appeared very self-confident, showed arrogance, and even allowed himself a grin. But over time, his behavior changed. In the following days, he came to court with a Bible in his hand and a cross around his neck, which investigators interpreted as an attempt to impress the jury and influence their emotions. His lawyer claimed that Anthony could not physically commit such an act because he had been diagnosed with an illness 5 years earlier. This illness caused muscle weakness and made repetitive movements difficult, which according to the lawyer made him incapable of committing the crime in Lisa's apartment. Nevertheless, the medical examinations of the year in which the crime occurred showed that the illness was under control and the treatment was effective. Moreover, the prosecution had solid evidence of his presence at the crime scene. Under Lisa's fingernails, they found his skin. On the pillowcase were his DNA traces, and on the toilet seat, his fingerprint. Despite this weighty evidence, Anthony insisted on not having seen Lisa since the late 80s. The prosecution suspected that Anthony had re-established contact with Lisa and had visited her at home. Possibly he wanted to revive the relationship, but when Lisa refused, the situation got out of control, and Anthony left the crime scene. The jury unanimously found him guilty of first-degree murder. But the story did not end here. During the court proceedings, Anthony contested the charges and declared that the 13-year delay in bringing charges violated his constitutional rights. This led to the downgrading of the charges from first to second degree, which meant a milder sentence. Finally, Anthony was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of applying for early release after 16 years. That is, in the year 2031, when he will be 72 years old. Since then, Anthony has been serving his sentence in prison and continues to claim to be innocent. Lisa's relatives hope that his application for early release will be rejected because they believe that he does not deserve freedom. They believe that his refusal to acknowledge guilt is a sign of lack of remorse, and the perpetrator should therefore not be released. The girl walked only a few meters from the school bus to her home, and then it seemed as if she simply dissolved into thin air. Her disappearance quickly attracted the attention of the entire city, as amazing new details kept coming to light during the investigation. Over many years, the investigators deciphered the mysterious sequence of events with enormous effort and tireless dedication, until they finally uncovered the shocking truth. Angie Guzman was born on the 18th of February 1984 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left the family before her birth, and she never saw him. When she was 1 year old, her mother married Ronald, who became like a real father to Angie, and soon afterward, a son was born. Angie always got along well with her stepfather and younger brother, was a peace-loving child, and tried to make friends with everyone in her environment. The family lived in a quiet residential area in St. Louis, where everyone looked out for the neighbors. 9-year-old Angie attended 4th grade at a local elementary school in 1993, which was only a few hundred meters from her home. She rode the bus to school, whose stop was near her house, and the friendly neighbors always kept an eye on the children when they came home. It was a local tradition to ensure that the children were doing well. On the 18th of November, Angie went to school as usual and was supposed to return home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She got on the school bus and reached her stop together with some children from the neighborhood, after which they went home together. When all the other children had gone home, Angie was alone. She had only a few minutes left to walk. But time passed, and Angie did not come home. After the bus had dropped off the children and about 30 minutes had passed, the parents began to worry. Normally, Angie lingered a little to talk with friends, but this time her delay was unusually long. Angie's mother and stepfather decided to check the path from the stop to their house. They spoke with other students who confirmed that the girl had arrived together with them and had set off for home. The parents became increasingly concerned. They turned to the neighbors who normally kept an eye on the children, but this time the women were busy and had noticed nothing unusual. Other parents too, whose houses lay along the street, had seen how Angie was going home. Family and friends began to thoroughly search the area along the route. When it became dark, the parents decided to ask the police for help. The investigators immediately joined the search. Given the cool weather, it was unlikely that Angie had gone alone. The police considered various possibilities, as just 10 days earlier, a similar incident with another girl had occurred in the neighboring district, which fortunately had ended well, but had triggered serious concern. In late March 2022, when a young woman had just left the school bus, a stranger tried to take her with him. Despite the threat, she managed to escape capture. This incident prompted law enforcement authorities to think about a possible connection of this event to the disappearance of a girl named Angie. In searching for her, service dogs were used, which discovered a trail at the bus stop and followed it to a point where the trail suddenly ended, which could indicate that Angie was taken away in a car. Despite the use of helicopters with thermal imaging cameras to check the surroundings on the first day of the search, no clues about the girl's whereabouts were found. On the morning of the following day, the police turned to local media and the news of the missing person spread quickly. On this day alone, more than 300 calls came in, which required the deployment of more than 20 additional officers to process the incoming information. The investigations also extended to Angie's stepfather, who denied any involvement and offered to undergo any checks to prove his innocence. The behavior of the girl's biological father, who maintained no contact with her and was observed from a distance, also drew the police's attention and brought a new turn to the investigation, which intensified interest in his person in the context of the ongoing investigations. The police intensified their efforts to investigate Angie's disappearance in March, after a resident was observed driving slowly through the area in a blue sedan. This person was seen under suspicious circumstances 10 days before the disappearance. Despite his claims to have an alibi the day before the events, the FBI and local authorities created a composite sketch of him and distributed it among the residents. The distribution of thousands of flyers and nationwide coverage did not lead to identifying this man. This drew public attention and many tips, which, however, did not bring the police closer to a solution. Angie's teacher told that shortly before her disappearance, she had spoken of an upcoming trip to nature with her uncle. Meanwhile, the increased public interest attracted psychics, who began to share their visions over the phone at Angie's house. One of them claimed that she was alive and hiding in a national park, 40 kilometers from her home. The investigators, however, concentrated on more tangible clues and ignored these statements. In hope of speeding up the process, a reward of $10,000 was offered for information about Angie's whereabouts, which led to even more tips. It was strange that her parents knew nothing about an alleged trip that she had mentioned. It was suspected that Angie knew someone who had taken her along. 9 days after her disappearance, a hunter in the national park came across a disturbing discovery in the forest and immediately informed the police. At the scene, traces of a makeshift shelter were found, and beside it lay personal items, including a notebook with the young woman's name. This event attracted considerable public and media attention. Angie was found in a condition that triggered serious concern for her well-being and confirmed the severity of her situation. The police also found evidence that the young woman must have been in the shelter recently. Fingerprints on the objects in the shelter gave hope for a quick resolution of the case. The condition of the found objects led the experts to conclude that Angie was in the shelter until the last hours before her discovery. At the end of March 2022, after unsuccessful attempts to link the disappearance with other similar cases in the databases, the police doubled their efforts in the investigation after a discovery in one of the houses. The city residents became more cautious and began to watch their children more closely. A few days after the beginning of the investigation, public concern intensified. At the beginning of December, a girl named Casey disappeared in a city that was 16 kilometers away from the location of the first missing person report. Casey set off to her friends, who lived only a few hundred meters from her home, but never arrived there. 10 days later, Casey was found in St. Louis. She was covered with a pink curtain. However, the details of what had happened remained unclear. Despite intensive searching for clues, the police could not draw any clear conclusions about the connection of this case to other incidents in the city. In the same month, the police arrested a person who was trying to disturb another young woman only a few days before Casey's disappearance. Initially, it was suspected that it might be the same person, but differences in the circumstances allowed for the possibility that the crimes were committed by different people. At the end of March 2022, Gary, a 37-year-old man, often visited St. Louis on business. In the context of investigating 2 disappearances, the investigators considered him as a possible suspect. But he could present a solid alibi, as he was not in the city at the time of the events. In the further course of the investigations, however, it turned out that Gary had behaved inappropriately toward 4 other people, which finally led to his conviction to 5 years of imprisonment. In February of the following year, the police made a new discovery. They found Casey's remains. Nearby, vehicle tracks were found, which experts later attributed to a pickup that is frequently used by a rental company. The investigators began to question the residents of the area where the pickup was found. A woman reported that she had seen such a vehicle near her neighbor's house. About a week after the disappearance, the police visited this house. The woman living there, who lived together with her life partner and her brother, claimed that none of them had rented such a pickup and were not involved in the matter. However, The police did not believe her words, obtained a search warrant, and discovered during the search in the basement traces that were connected to Casey, as well as objects that had to do with the case. In the course of further investigations, it turned out that the brother had rented the pickup, whereupon he was arrested. Initially, he denied everything, but after being presented with solid evidence, the man admitted his actions. He explained that Casey came to him on her own to invite his nephew for a walk. In the house, he suggested going to the basement, where he tried to do something that I cannot say on YouTube, but she screamed. In the resulting panic, he accidentally pushed her, and she fell unluckily, whereupon he covered her with sheets. Thomas went to work, and when he returned, he learned from his sister that she had seen something concerning in his basement. She asked him to quickly remove everything without wanting to know details. She remained in the basement for a week, as the city was intensively searching for the missing girl, and Thomas was afraid to transport her. As soon as the situation calmed down, he rented a truck, drove her to St. Louis, and left her there. Ultimately, the man received the harshest possible sentence, but died a few years later in custody from an illness. In Angie's case, he denied any guilt, and the investigators concluded that the crimes were not connected to each other. The investigations came to a standstill for months. The police still received tips, although their number decreased. Years after Angie's murder, when the deadline for the financial reward offer expired, the investigators feared a reduction in public support. But then came an unexpected turn. A local businessman donated $250,000 as a reward for information about Angie's case, which at that time was one of the most significant amounts. And indeed, the investigators began to receive more information. Until the year 2001, all leads led to a dead end. But the situation changed abruptly when an unexpected call came in from a correctional facility. The prisoner, Corey Fox, claimed he had been involved in a series of disappearances, including the disappearance of Angie Guzman. The investigators immediately set out to him to learn details. Fox claimed he and an accomplice had lured Angie into an abandoned building to hide there. Originally, the perpetrators planned to demand ransom, but later decided, out of fear of discovery, to eliminate all traces. He described everything that happened down to the smallest detail. But his story contained contradictions. For example, Fox mentioned plastic ties, although metal ties were actually used. His confession to other crimes that he could not have physically committed raised further doubts. This led the police to suspect that he might be relying on information from the news. In the summer 2002, the case gained attention again when a young woman disappeared in another district of St. Louis. Initially, it was assumed that the same perpetrator was at work, but it quickly turned out that it was a different criminal who was arrested the same day. After several years, the investigators decided in the year 2007 to reopen an old case. When reviewing the files, they noticed an interesting fact. Roger Martin's car was parked near the discovery site. Roger claimed he had come hunting, but had no equipment for it with him. The new investigation team decided to pay special attention to this man. After checking his background, it turned out that Roger had previously acted unlawfully. Furthermore, Roger had been involved in an unpleasant incident near the discovery site a few years before the find. This information was recorded in the database, but at the time, the police had not seriously suspected him. To correct this, the investigators invited Roger to a 9-hour interrogation. Despite all efforts, they could not obtain a confession or useful information from him. After the interrogation, they compared his fingerprints with those that had been found earlier, but found that they did not match. Roger insisted on his innocence and assured that he had been at work at the time of the incident, but the police could not confirm his alibi. Despite the absence of direct evidence of his guilt, the investigators continued to consider him as a possible suspect in this puzzling case. After a long phase in which the investigation stagnated, the administration of St. Louis founded a special task force in the year 2018 to dedicate itself once again to this difficult case. New investigators were ready to examine in detail all evidence collected since 1993. Technological progress gave hope for a breakthrough. 3 important pieces of evidence included handcuffs, tape, and a piece of clothing that was placed in Angie's mouth. Experts had previously unsuccessfully tried to find traces of the perpetrator's genetic material on them. Despite earlier failures, the investigators decided to re-examine all materials with modern technology. First, the experts concentrated on the handcuffs, but a thorough examination showed that the entire surface was saturated with the victim's blood. Therefore, hope for a DNA analysis of this piece of evidence quickly disappeared. Then the team turned to the tape. But when they opened the box with the evidence, they found that the tape had completely dissolved over the years. The last piece of evidence was the underwear. The entire team knew that this was their last hope. Despite the obvious contact of the perpetrator with this piece of evidence, the long contact with Angie could have erased all traces. Nevertheless, the experts decided to apply the most modern analytical methods and examine every millimeter of the fabric. And suddenly they found a tiny DNA fragment of unknown origin that was sufficient for analysis and finally brought the long-awaited breakthrough in this case. Specialists determined that the found DNA sample belonged to a man and immediately entered it into the FBI database. The perpetrators are often not found in this database, so considerable efforts are required to determine their identity. This time, however, the investigators were lucky. The match was found immediately. It was Earl Cox, who was 58 years old when he went to prison in the year 2003. Previously, he had not been connected with the Angie case, but he had a criminal past. Earl was first convicted in the year 1982 when he was serving in the army in Germany and working as a babysitter. Everything went well, until some girls told their parents that something unwanted had happened. Earl was sentenced to 8 years in prison and discharged from the military. He spent 3 years in prison and was released on parole, after which he moved to St. Louis. 4 years later, he was arrested on new charges, but due to insufficient evidence, the charges were dropped, and he was not punished. However, his arrest violated his parole conditions, so he had to spend another year in prison. After his release, Earl returned to St. Louis to his relatives. It is suspected that he might have been involved in an incident with Angie a year later, but the details are still unclear. In the year 2002, he was arrested again. It turned out that Earl had organized a network for exchanging inappropriate materials that I cannot name on YouTube, but his story suggests what it was about. Earl was arrested in the year 2003 during a months-long FBI operation. An undercover investigator created an anonymous account and posed as a 14-year-old woman. Earl sent her money to travel to his city, but when he came to the agreed meeting point, armed investigators awaited him and arrested him. During the search of his house, 45,000 inappropriate photos and evidence of his role in a problematic online portal were found. Thanks to this evidence, 60 more people who were involved in the activities of this portal could be arrested, making this operation one of the largest in the country. Earl was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but after his sentence expired, the court extended his detention because he was classified as a potential danger to society. In the year 2019, his DNA was linked to another old case, leading investigators to the gates of his prison. Earl refused to speak with them and demanded a lawyer. The police, recognizing the severity of the evidence, offered Earl's lawyer an agreement, a guilty plea in exchange for a milder sentence, life imprisonment instead of the ultimate punishment. After realizing that his case might not be successful, Earl decided to make an agreement with the authorities. When they visited him again in prison, he described his version of events. Some points of his story sounded questionable, but the police were seeking a confession. Earl told that on the 18th of November 1993, he was driving through the neighborhood where his mother and sister lived when his car suddenly stopped. As he tried to find the reason for the breakdown, he noticed a school bus from which students were getting off. Everyone went home except for one girl who approached him and, as he says, started a conversation. Believing that she might be cold, Earl offered her to get into his car, and she agreed. The investigators doubted his story. First, the girl probably would not have agreed to go with a person unknown to her, especially when her house was only a few dozen meters away. Second, the investigators did not believe that his car had broken down. Although Earl said that the engine stalled, he also claimed that the car started as soon as the girl approached him. Probably he noticed her and immediately decided to talk to her. Earl could get her to get into the car through various pretexts and even direct threats. This scenario seemed more plausible than his own explanations. However, the investigators' efforts resulted in Earl admitting his guilt. In August 2012, he was put on trial and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, Angie's mother, who died of an illness in the year 2016, could not experience this moment. Her husband Ronald stated that Earl should be held responsible for both losses, as he believes that losing his daughter took away his wife's life force. As for Earl, his case was not yet closed. The prosecution decided to review earlier accusations regarding inappropriate behavior for which he escaped punishment and spent only 1 year in prison due to a violation of the conditions of his earlier release. The police contacted one of the victims, now an adult, who agreed to testify against Earl. This man, already sentenced to life imprisonment, pleaded guilty and received an additional 10-year prison sentence. After the verdict was announced, the victim testified in court that despite the severe trials, she strives to live happily and fulfilled, while he will remain behind bars.